Okay, now I'm going to attempt to show you how to make a voice coil for a Rubanoid. And for this part you're going to need three things. You're going to need a CD case. You're going to need, and the CD case might end up being destroyed if you can't get the voice coil off, so keep that in mind. You're going to need, for the voice coil, a spool of 32 gauge wire, enough to come up to about 5.1 ohms, which is what I've been making my voice coils because they seem to work well at that setting or at that resistance, and it's high enough it can be used with most amplifiers. And you're going to need a piece of shipping tape, and that's the hard part. And I'm going to tell you, it's easier to do this if you use masking tape, but masking tape has a weight to it that causes a problem. It adds extra weight to the voice coil when you make it, and if you use a shipping tape, the super glue will normally come off, and so you can strip the super glue off, leaving just the tape. Now, here's one of the first difficulties. You need to get this onto the CD case reverse side up, so, and I recommend doing it to this end because it'd be harder to get off the other end of the case. So what you want is sticky side out when you're putting this on there, and try to get it pretty even on there if you can. And you don't want a whole lot of it overlapping because you want to keep the voice coil as light as possible, so try to see what you can do about getting it potentially as tight as you can on here so it'll stay put, and you're going to wind your wire on that. Okay, so I reckon that's good enough for a start. So we're going to snip the tape off here, and what you're going to do is put a little bit of glue on this voice coil as you wind it. The sticky on the tape on the outside is going to help the wires stay put when you put them on there. Just don't get it stuck too well to the table first. So get your tape on there evened out and close to the edge, because you're going to have to try to pull it off the edge, and we're going to do that without damaging the voice coil. So we'll start with this here. We've got our tape on there. And so then we're going to take our voice coil wire and start winding. And you want to leave yourself enough hanging off the end that you won't have a problem attaching it when you're done. I think I'm actually going to wind this voice coil this direction because it's going to be easier for me just because of the way my hands work. So I'm going to give it a little more, put this closer to the end because I don't want to have to pull it like too far off. Okay. And you're going to try to keep these wires as you wind it as straight as you can and as stuck together as you can, so that everything comes out nice and neat without any gaps in it if you're lucky. That's the goal. And then just start in and have at it, and try and wind it as neat as you can and as straight as you can. And I've done 2 or 3 of these now, and they're a little bit of a nuisance, but you kind of get the feel of it. You notice this first one, those strands are kind of separated out a bit, so I'm going to try and pull everything nice and tight there. Push a little more of that super glue down, and my method of doing it always gets me super glue fingers, which isn't ideal, but there you go. So now as I wind this every so often, making sure that the windings are nice and close. I don't really have more of a zoom in on my camera to zoom in any closer. You can always run your fingernail along there and make sure they stay together and tight, and that's what the glue on the tape is for, to hold everything in place while you do this. Just keep doing it every so often. Put a little more super glue on there, hold it in place a little bit better. And when you get done, you're going to cover the whole thing with super glue so that your voice coil is going to come out glued together, and then we'll remove the tape from it, hopefully, when we're done, and that'll be good. So what you'll need to do is wind it a ways and then check the voice coil resistance. So you're going to need a multimeter for that. And what you'll do when you need to test a spot, use a fine piece of sandpaper like a 220 grit, sand a bare end on the end of the voice coil, and then you sand just a small, like an inch long spot on the uncut wire, and you measure it from there to the end, and you keep winding wire on there until you got the resistance you want. And 5.1 ohms seems to work well for me for two reasons. It's above the 4 ohm, which is, a lot of amps can't drive anything before 4 ohm or below 4 ohm unless you have a good amp. I've got a couple that'll drive down to 2 ohm loads, but that's also a strain on the amplifier to drive loads that low, and it's unnecessary. So the more copper you have, the more sensitive the driver is going to be, and that means the more output it's going to put out to a certain extent. And I could make these 8 ohms pretty easily, but I don't want to do that for a couple of reasons. Because number one is I'm making a tweeter, and making a tweeter, the high end response is important, and if you want to get up around 20 kilohertz with these things or close, I think the last one I made went up about 18 pretty flat and then dropped off a little bit after that. 15,000 hertz is higher than most people can hear, but adding more weight to the voice coil, and copper of course is the heaviest thing we've got on our diaphragm, so adding more copper to go up to 8 ohm also increases the weight. And with this method that I'm going to show you, that I'm doing now, these guys will go up to around 18 to 20 kilohertz pretty flat. But if the voice coil starts getting heavier, or the diaphragm gets a little heavier, then it won't. I'm going to just take this in the house and continue winding it. And when I've got it measured and done, I'll show you what that looks like. That's basically it. Just keep doing that until you've got your ohms you recommend. And if you're using it for a tweeter like I am, I would definitely recommend the 4 ohms. Like I say, 5.1 in this case works good for me. But if you're making one more for bass frequencies, which is also definitely a thing, you need to you could make it 8 ohms easily, but then you need to adjust the magnet gap, or adjust the magnets, because the magnets we're using for this, the voice coil will leave the magnet gap rapidly if we're going down into lower frequencies. So we're going to need to, for a lower frequency version, we'll need to double up the magnets. So I'm going to go take this in and continue the process in there, and we'll go from there. Okay, so now that we've got our voice coil made, and we've super glued it down nicely, we've got both our wires coming off one end, and the resistance value is somewhere between 5 and 6 ohms for my recommendation. If you make a pair of these for a stereo pair, get them the same. This one is 5.5 ohms. I measured it. So you can look at this and see about how much wire is on there. You start getting close to that, just do a couple checks for the resistance, as I already talked about. So then you might need to work this back and forth. It's usually a little difficult to get off this one I kind of pre-worked it back and forth because there's no point showing that on camera, but you just got to work it till it comes loose. If you did it right and didn't get any glue on the plastic, it won't be glued in place, and you will be able to slip the voice coil off in this fashion, as you can see here. So the voice coil is away. In this case, we didn't have to destroy our plastic, but I made one that I had to, so, you know, whatever it takes, right? And now I want to try and actually remove the voice coil from the plastic. So, okay, now we'll see if we can get this tape from off of here. We're going to start by just cutting it down to a reasonable size to work with here. Be careful you don't cut through your copper. 32 gauge is fine enough that you can cut right through it if we're not careful. So we're going to start by just trying to undo the tape here if we can. Now that's working perfectly. You can see the tape coming loose from the voice coil, so using this method with this kind of shipping tape, you can remove it, and that is what you want. Because you really want your coil to be as lightweight as possible for best performance if you're going for a tweeter, which we are here. You also don't want to make it much more than that. You have another factor operating when you make the voice coil is the impedance of the voice coil. I recommended 5 ohms at a resistance 5 to 6 ohms. I did this one at 5.5, and your left and right ones need to match when you're doing this. You need to get your left and right values the same, so if you're making 2 voice coils, measure them, you know, work with it till you get the resistance the same. Then you get this off, and you won't have additional tape weighting your diaphragm down. It's not real heavy, but it does make a difference. And then I was talking about the 4 and 8 ohms. If you go with 8 ohms, you've got more inductance in the coil, which means you've got more wire in it, which means more wire makes it respond to the magnetism a little bit better. I got one wire that's a little bit loose there. We're going to get that fixed when we put it together. Might want to put a little glue on that and glue it. Anyway, it should have been super glued a little bit better there, so I'm going to do that first. But if you got 8 ohms inductance, you're also reducing the amount of high frequencies it can produce, because it forms part of a filter. Not only is it a voice coil, it's actually a little bit of a filter coil also, which kind of happens naturally with coils. So there's our coil. I'm going to get just a little super glue for that one wire, and then I'll show you how we're going to fold this thing. Now we'll see if I can figure out how to get this folded again. Actually, I'm going to put the back side in, so we're going to fold it up like this, hopefully not make a giant frigging mess of this. This is what the voice coil is supposed to look like, more or less, once it's got folded flat. I did a bad job of folding it. The previous 2 I did much neater, but that's the idea. So you get a point on the very ends, and you've got both the wires coming off one end like so. And like I say, that's folded over badly, but I'm going to use that because I don't want to try and redo it again because it can be a nuisance. So we're going to use this and we're going to make our diaphragm. Okay, so this is the plastic we're using. And you'll need a sheet of this for your diaphragm, maybe 2 sheets. And you can see the size down there, 0.005 inch for this exact one. Now my preference would have been when I started this to find a slightly harder plastic with a slightly harder surface, but that would change the springiness. So we're going to make that for this. You'll notice the price on the right hand. That's because we bought this from a local art store, so always a little more expensive than getting it through Amazon, but nice to support your local businesses too. Anyway, we're going to start with this. We're going to mark it out. We're going to make our diaphragm, and we're going to glue our voice coil onto it. So you're also going to need some type of contact cement, which we've got this stuff from Walmart, which is fine. I can't make the tube look good anymore, but you get the idea. It's cheap and that works. And then to smooth it all out with, when we get it all glued together, we're going to use a rolling pin. And we're going to use that to make it all nice, mash it all nice and flat once it gets glued. Okay, so the first thing is we've got a piece of white paper on the plastic, so we peeled our piece of plastic off from the batch. Take the plastic. Since this is for art, it has plastic or paper over it, so the pieces of plastic won't get damaged, which obviously isn't something you need for this project, but there we go. Oh yeah, and you'll also need a ruler, because it'll be hard to do without that. Okay, so we've got our Sharpie we're going to mark this with. And you notice it's 9 inches wide. That's exactly what we want. So we want 9 inches by 4.5 inches on this diaphragm. And we might go bigger than that. Or smaller than that, I mean. So we're going to start out making the bigger diaphragm, which is 9 inches by 4.5 inches. We might cut that down later depending on how performance turns out. I think we probably will cut it down to about 3 inches to get the high frequencies up, but I'm going to try it this way first and try and get as much surface area as we can, simultaneously getting the high frequencies as high as we can. So we're going to need to make 2 pieces, 9 by 4.5 inches. By the way, if you want to make this pretty, you might want to do some other way of cutting this. I think we'll end up having our Sharpie marks show through a little bit, but I don't care since this is still in the prototype phase, though. I think the way they sound, it might be just about my final version for the tweeter. We'll find out when I get this one done. After all, my goal isn't to prototype it forever. It's just to have a much better sounding set of tweeters than I had with my metal dome bullet tweeters. They're metal dome. They have a chamber on the inside, an air chamber, and then a little vent hole in the end of the built-in air chamber, and they're not very smooth response. And it pays to cut these things, and especially when gluing them, to do it precise. So our voice coil is going to go dead center in these, so we're going to mark out a center line. Of course, since we're making these 4.5 by 9 inches long, our center line is It's going to be at 4.5 inches, of course. That's half a 9. So do that to both of them. And then we're going to make 2 lines outside the width of our voice coil. Our voice coil is going to overhang slightly. Okay, so now we're going to measure this. And from our center line, we're going to go over 1/2 inch plus 1/8. In other words, 5/8. Since this is a big Sharpie, our lines are not going to be perfectly precise, but we want it bigger than the voice coil because we want this part to be flat where it comes out of the wooden pieces, so we don't get any of the diaphragm bumping into the wood, restricting it. By the way, also, you can't use super glue to glue this on because it won't stick to the plastic well enough. So that's why we need a contact cement. And I also beforehand, you need to try it on the plastic and make sure that it doesn't melt the plastic, because some of them can. So you have to be careful of that, because if it melts it, then it'll be warped and it won't work well. Okay, so now the next step is to put some masking tape on there. And I recommend using masking tape or painter's masking tape for this, because we want it to come off fairly easy when we're done. But we're using this to keep the glue from getting onto the plastic plus past these lines. So we want a very definite line here that the glue doesn't go past if we can. And the more accurate you can get this part, as far as the glue and stuff, the more accurate you make these plastic pieces match to each other, the better your unit is going to perform. This tape will be removed later, but we're going to tape both pieces first. You want to get these as equal as you can, because your diaphragm here is also going to be the spring that returns the voice coil to the center. In standard speakers, as many of you may know, probably know, the voice coil is returned to center by something called a spider, which is a separate, usually treated fabric or something that acts as a spring and returns the cone to the center position. And that's one of the advantages of this kind of driver. It doesn't have the extra resistance because it doesn't need an extra spring to return the cone to center if you make it right. I know a lot of people who make these are using like rubber bands to return the cone to center. But this way, if this works out right, we don't have to. So I'm going to apply a little of our glue at this point. Apply it right up to the edge of the tape. Try to apply it kind of neatly if you can. You want this all to be squished into as neat as a sandwich as you can, but you also want the voice coil to be very definitely attached. You do it with your fingers like me, you might also want to have a paper towel handy. So I'm going to apply this. So, and you want this voice coil centered in all directions as much as you can get it. You also want it as flat and non-wrinkly as you can get it. So we're going to roll out this one just to get it really mashed into there to start with. And now we're going to do the same thing to the other piece here. And again, make sure you put the glue on the same side. I know it might be a little hard to tell on the camera, but the glue goes on the same side up as the tape is up. This particular glue, you got to smooth it down pretty quickly or it'll tack up and then you won't be able to. I should point out that safety precautions, it's probably not good to just stick your finger in the glue and I don't know what you might absorb from it, and it's also not good to smell it. I'm assuming people at least know these basic aspects, so I suppose I'm not remiss in pointing them out. So you don't want to be breathing this stuff in either, any more than you have to. So do it in a relatively well ventilated place, and it all depends on what kind of glue you got. And so you want to get this thing just as exactly even with the other one as you can, and with difference in the widths of the pens and little variations in the widths of the line and stuff. It's never going to be exactly perfect, but you can get it awfully close, and that's what you want. Just get it as absolutely as close as you can and then squish it down on there. Roll it right in there. And I'd recommend probably turning it over and rolling it the other direction too. I'd recommend really pushing this down on the edges. You won't really want the two pieces of plastic to be glued together. At the edges there where the glue is, and not loose. If you can, you'd like that glue to be a perfectly straight line by the time you let it dry and take off the tape. I'm sure if anybody's interested in making these things look pretty, you can figure out how to do it for this type of thing. My focus is always something that works well as compared to something that looks good. Now, if I was making it for somebody else, that would be a consideration, but making it for myself, it's not. So now I'm going to let that dry. You can see what we got there. That's going to be our diaphragm. I'm going to let that dry. And then we'll open that up and make use of it. Okay, everybody. Now this is after the diaphragm is nice and cemented. It's dried overnight. So I'm going to I wanted to show you taking the tape off the diaphragm. I'm going to take this diaphragm apart and get the tape out of it. And you want to be careful and pull the tape out at the seam. You don't want to tear the glue line at all, because you want these to be as equal and straight as you can, because it'll make your diaphragm perform better. After I get this one apart, I'm going to test it for high frequencies. And if it doesn't go quite up far enough because the plastic is a little heavy, I may have to cut it down a little bit. If so, that's not a big deal. It kind of depends on what I want to do too. The question is, do I need high frequency response all the way up to 20K? My hearing certainly doesn't go that high. However, I have heard it can make a subjective difference as far as giving the driver an airy sound, which is why you can even buy super tweeters that go up to 30 or 40K if you have a lot of money to spend. There are also several technical reasons why a super tweeter isn't necessarily the best option for already made speakers unless it can fit in the exact same space as the original tweeter, because what you're doing if you put one on top, you're causing a time arrival difference between the frequencies. That time arrival difference can cause peaks and cancellations also. And ideally, things should be in phase. Anything you add, super tweeter also is going to have some kind of crossover, at least a capacitor on it. And then getting the output at the crossover point in phase with the phase of your speaker is the problem if you don't have it real close. So if the super tweeter is only producing frequencies higher than what your tweeter produces and doesn't overlap below, then it's not a big deal. You still have to have some kind of a crossover on it to keep the low frequencies out. But we'll try this and see how high it gets. Probably if we go up to 17 or 18K, I'll leave it good. If not, I'll cut it down a little bit. So I'm going to test it out and we'll see.